floor up for questions. Thank you.
I think what we're going to do is I'm going to frame this first by kind of giving a little bit of a story of how we got to where we are so that we know where we are right now, and then turn it over to Gail to give some perspective, and then Jason for some more detail. So I'm Arnie Alpert from the American Friends Service Committee, a Quaker organization. Those of you who know your history know that Quakers have been paying attention to prisons ever since they started getting locked up in the 17th century for doing things like not paying proper respect to their betters. Anyway, so the Service Committee has been involved and concerned about issues having to do with prisons for most of our existence, which goes back to 1917. I've been with the New Hampshire program of AFSC since 1981. So I turned 31 last August. I don't know if I'm looking, but that's how old I am. So, and I've had dealings over that time off and on paying attention to issues of prison conditions in New Hampshire, and also paying a great deal of attention actually to the effort to try to abolish the death penalty, which I'd love to talk about later at great length, but that's not our topic for tonight. But anyway, but that is also related in terms of these questions that you raised, Richard, about how do we as a society deal with issues of people who commit offenses against society and against others, and can we come up with a reasonable, sensible, moral way to handle those dilemmas. When this issue of privatizing the prisons came up, it set off alarm bells for me in a number of different areas. One is that we are advocates for workers and for workers' rights, and we knew that the whole drive toward private prison is deeply connected to an effort to try to destroy unions and drive down labor standards. That's how a prison can become profitable, is by doing that. We are deeply concerned about the conditions under which people are incarcerated. And we know, for example, through work that my colleague Caroline Isaacs has done in Arizona, that the conditions in private prisons are worse for prisoners. They're also worse for the people who are working there. They're more dangerous. And we thought that was not something that we would want to happen. And it also leads to a problem with democratic accountability. This is the We the People group. I know that these are issues that you've talked about. So what happens when motivations of profit start to take precedence over over the public interest and over the ability of our government to actually be itself the voice for what the people want and the people need, instead of outsourcing that to someone whose interests are different. So when this question of privatization came up in New Hampshire, I started to pay attention, and I started to meet up people from other groups that were paying attention, and together we formed something called New Hampshire Prison Watch, and together we've now been monitoring this, and Jason and I will talk a little bit more about that maybe as we go along. Let me tell you just a little bit about the process, the timeline that we've been on here over the last couple of years. Anybody remember Craig Benson? Anyway, he was the governor a while ago. He didn't last very long, but he had a number of bad ideas, one of which was to look into privatizing prisons. He had a task force that looked into it, and they actually studied it pretty carefully and said, not going to work, not a good idea. We'd save a little bit of money, but it's not worth the hassle. Don't do this. But the idea didn't go away, and particularly because, again, you do have some very profitable companies which are looking for markets. So when we had, Don, I don't know what you want to call the group of people who were running the show at the State House over the last couple of years. Is it fair to just as a
irresponsible
clue? There was a group of irresponsible people who were made up the majority of the House and the Senate for a 2-year period, to quote Representative Schlackman. And they floated a number of ideas, one of which was to, as a way to try to solve the state's budget problems, to ship 600 prisoners to other states and send them to private prisons. They looked into it, it wasn't going to save any money, that got abandoned. But in the budget process, in the fine print of something called HB2, the Budget Rider Proposal, dozens and dozens of pages of fine print, there were a couple of lines, one of which actually ordered the Commissioner of Corrections to submit a request for proposals to companies for private delivery of correctional services. And another provision created a legislative committee whose purpose was to develop a plan to privatize the Department of Corrections. And it was very vague. It didn't say to look into it. It didn't say to consider which parts. It said to privatize the department. Anyway, now, had it just been the legislature thinking about this, would have been bad enough, but in fact, Governor Lynch also had some interest in seeing a process like this go forward. So with the governors pushing the Department of Corrections, teaming up with the agency of the state government that actually administers contracts, it's called the Department of Administrative Services, and together they issued a very complicated RFP, a request for proposals, that went out in November of 2011. Basically going out into the ether saying, hey, private companies, would you be interested in building for New Hampshire a women's prison, a men's prison, or what we're going to call a hybrid prison, a facility that would house both men and women? And we'd like to know whether you are interested in building and operating such a facility, whether you're interested in renovating existing facilities and then operating it, or whether maybe you're interested in building something like this which you would continue to own, but then lease it to the state. These proposals were due, it was very complicated, boxes and boxes and boxes of material delivered by 4 different private corporations ended up being delivered to the state by their deadline. Because the proposal also insisted that the facility would have to accommodate at a minimum 1,550 New Hampshire inmates, although they're projecting the population would be dropping. But below that, the state was going to guarantee a minimum occupancy of 80%. Now, of course, they would be able to fill the rest of the beds by importing prisoners from elsewhere, which might include undocumented immigrants who had been picked up by the feds, or might include people from other states. This facility would have to include minimum, medium, close, maximum security, and the secure psychiatric unit, which was interesting because in no other state are these private contractors operating a prison with that range of what we could call services. I'm not sure that's the correct term. And they said that this was a direct quote from the RFP, proposals may include construction of larger facilities designed to accommodate regional correctional needs in order to reduce New Hampshire's costs. Governor Lynch for years had been saying, let's build a really big prison that we can import prisoners from Maine and Vermont to come here. So that was also part of the mix here, right? While this was going on, those of us who were concerned, or shall we say even alarmed by this, started running into each other at some of these meetings, and that's how we formed the New Hampshire Prison Watch group, and we can say a little bit more about that. And I believe I just saw Peter Burst slip into the back of the room. Peter? Anyway, he's, are you the chair, the president, the...
No, I'm a member of the board.
He's a member of the board of a group called Citizens for Criminal Justice Reform, so that's part of our team here. In this process, none of the companies bid on the idea of building a prison for women, even though, as you mentioned, Richard, that is actually the #1 need that the state has in terms of corrections right now. Not a single private company was interested in building and operating that. Why? They can't make money running a women's prison. There aren't enough women, they need too much services. But 4 companies submitted bids to either build a men's prison or what we're calling a hybrid prison. The 4 companies are the Corrections Corporation of America, the largest private prison company in the country and I believe the world. They hired 4 lobbyists, and they announced that they had their eyes on sites in Lancaster, Northumberland, and Hinsdale, New Hampshire, where they would site their private prison that they would run. The second company, Management and Training Corporation, hired 3 lobbyists and found a site in Manchester on Hackett Hill Road. The third company, Geo, which is the second biggest private company, they hired 2 lobbyists and they never revealed where they wanted to site their prison. So that's still a state secret. It's in some of those boxes which are still somewhere in the State House Annex. And the 4th company, which was called the Hunt Group, which later merged with another group called Carter Goebel Lee, which is known as CGL, a Hunt Group company, was the 4th bidder. And they, because they don't actually operate prisons, they teamed up with another company called LaSalle and put in a bid. And we believe that they are actually primarily, they were told they couldn't bid to just do the leaseback option. They had to have the operation, so that's where they brought in LaSalle. But really, they are primarily interested in building a prison and leasing leasing it to the state and continuing, in effect, to have a service contract like you would get from one of the, when you buy a VCR. Do we still have VCRs? Anyway, and something like that. And you go and you buy a computer and they sell you a service contract, and they're actually making more money from the service contract than they are from the equipment. Anyway, that's what CGL, that's the business that they are in. Now, most of the details on this are secret. And because this is so complicated, because there were so many different options, and the finances are so complicated, and the state didn't say, this is what we want, what's it going to cost? The state said, here's some general ideas, tell us what you can do. It was so complicated that the people from Administrative Services and Department of Corrections were not able to figure this out themselves. So the state went and put out another contract, got one company to bid on it, a company called MGT of America, and paid them $171,000 to figure out what was in all those boxes of paper, and help the state then be able to figure out whether we want to take up any of these companies on their lovely offers. MGT's report was supposed to be due October 5th. October 5th came, Jason called up, said, where's the report? I said, well, we're giving them an extension till October 15th. October 15th came, Jason called him up and said, do you have the report? He said, well, no, sometime in November, which would be after the election. November came along. When's the report due? They said, well, mid-December. Mid-December came along, and now there's a new proposal for a contract extension going to the Executive Council, extending the MGT contract to February 28th, providing that their report to the state would actually be due by December 21st. December 21st came, no report, and today is January 30th. There is still no report yet from MGT of America, so we're not quite sure when this analysis is going to be complete. But it was on the basis of that the governor was supposed to figure out whether or not to actually create a contract and put it before the Executive Council for consideration. And while Maggie Hassan, your neighbor, did say quite clearly on the campaign trail that she did not like the idea of full-fledged privatization, when this question of a build-lease option or lease-back or a public-private partnership was put before her, she said she would be interested in thinking about it. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. That's where we're at right now with the process. With maybe one additional point, and that's that a piece of legislation has been proposed, which is called House Bill 443, and in fact there's a public hearing scheduled for next Thursday at 1:30 p.m. and there's a flyer on the back table about this. And in this legislation it says the general court, that's what Donna and Frank and people call themselves when they're up in Concord, the general court hereby finds and declares that the management and operation of a correctional facility involves functions that are inherently governmental. The imposition of punishment on errant citizens through incarceration requires the state and local government to exercise their coercive police powers over individuals and is thus distinguishable from privatization in other areas of government. And this bill then goes on to say that the Commissioner of Corrections shall not enter into a contract with a private or for-profit entity for the custody of state or county inmates. So part of what's going on here is an end around the legislature to take a major policy move with huge budgetary implications, and by handling it as a contract instead of as legislation, it ends up evading legislative scrutiny and having only the governor and the 5 members of the Executive Council being the ones who get to vote on it. And if they vote to let a contract, then our legislators are basically left paying the bill. And figuring out where the money's going to come from to do that. So there's a lot of issues that are raised here, and I bet my 5 to 7 minutes are up. I'm going to pass the microphone to Gail.